Ever get lost in those stories as a kid? You know those ones about like explorers landing on new shores and finding these civilizations that no one knew existed?
Oh, yeah, totally.
It was like a total clash of worlds, right?
Yeah.
So that's kind of what we're diving into today. It's the 16th century, the story of Hernan Cortés and the Spanish conquest of Mexico. You know, you sent over that episode of The Rest is History, and it's like got my inner explorer all fired up.
It's such a classic story, right? I mean, everyone's fascinated by it.
Yeah.
But it's easy to kind of fall into that trap of like conquistadors versus the Aztecs, good versus evil.
Right.
But it's so much more complicated than that.
For sure. So the podcast starts with Cortez's background. Late 15th century Spain. Not exactly peaceful times, right?
No, not at all. Think about it. It was a world still recovering from the Reconquista. Centuries of conflict between Christians and Muslims. And Cortés, he grew up in Extremadura, a region where violence was basically a way of life. Feuding families, skirmishes, this constant tension simmering just below the surface. It's no wonder he was ambitious, even ruthless.
Almost like he was destined for conquest from the start.
Right?
The podcast mentions his family wanted him to be a notary, like a stable career, but Cortés wanted more.
Yeah, he wanted adventure wealth, maybe even a bit of glory. And that hunger led him across the ocean, first Hispaniola, and then Cuba, and the Spanish colonies back then. They were definitely not paradise.
Yeah, that's where things take a darker turn.
Yeah.
Hispaniola, a textbook example of colonial exploitation, right?
Yeah, unfortunately, imagine seeing that devastation firsthand. Disease wiping out the native Taino people, the brutality of slavery violence everywhere. Cortés was right in the middle of it all, both witnessing and participating. It's important to consider how these experiences shaped him, how he approached indigenous populations later on.
It's like a reminder that heroes, or at least the people we see as heroes, usually have a dark side too. Almost like Cortés got a crash course in exploitation and conquest before even setting foot in Mexico.
That's a great way to put it. And we
Right.
can't forget, Cortés wasn't some lone wolf. He was a man of his time, shaped by the beliefs of the Spanish Empire. The religious zeal, the thirst for gold, and that unshakable belief in their own superiority.
Right, so conquering new lands and converting everyone to Christianity wasn't just for personal gain. It was like a divine mission, a justification for their actions.
Exactly. It's a tough concept to grasp from our modern perspective.
Right.
But to really understand Cortés, we have to see things through his eyes, however unsettling that might be.
That's history for you, right?
Yeah.
It makes us face these uncomfortable truths, wrestle with perspectives that are so different from our own.
Absolutely. And even with all that ambition, Cortés's early years in the New World were surprisingly quiet. Worked as a notary, got caught up in scandals, even spent time in jail. Not exactly the resume you'd expect for a future conqueror.
It's like fate had other plans for him. And that's when the rumor started spreading among the Spanish in Cuba about a powerful and wealthy empire to the west. The promise of untold riches. It must have reignited Cortés's ambition.
And these weren't just rumors. The first Spanish expeditions to the Yucatan Peninsula, led by guys like Francisco Hernández de Córdoba and Juan de Grijalva, came back with proof. Complex societies, incredible architecture, and of course, gold.
Of course.
These encounters fueled Spanish curiosity, but more importantly, their greed and ambition.
It's like finding gold in a riverbed. Everyone's rushing to stake their claim.
Right.
The podcast really highlights Grijalva's expedition, how quickly things changed. They land on the coast, meet the Totonaco people, and suddenly they're showered with gifts of gold and stories of an even richer empire inland. Can you imagine the temptation to push further inland?
Oh, it must have been incredible, but Grijalva played it safe. Went back to Cuba with his treasures and stories, leaving the door open for someone else to seize the opportunity.
And that's where Diego Velázquez, the governor of Cuba, comes in. He's like a savvy investor who sees a huge opportunity. But he needs someone to lead the charge. Someone capable, but also someone he thinks he can control.
Yeah, and this is where it gets interesting. A classic case of underestimating your opponent. Velázquez needed a leader for this expedition, someone with experience, but not too ambitious. Someone he could trust to follow orders. And in a decision that changed history, he chose Hernán Cortés. It's crazy to think how one decision can change everything. What if Velázquez had picked someone else? What if Cortés had just stayed a notary, but I guess ambition had other plans?
Yeah, the podcast really makes it clear that Cortés grabbed this opportunity with both hands after years in Velázquez's shadow. This was his chance to shine, to become a legend.
Totally, and it wasn't just about personal ambition, although that was definitely part of it. Cortés really believed in that Spanish mission, expanding the empire, spreading Christianity, getting rich and famous along the way. It was a powerful mix.
So he had the drive, the passion. But what about the resources? Conquering an empire takes more than just willpower. You need ships, men, weapons. It's a huge operation. How do you manage all that?
Well, that's where his cleverness comes in, and maybe a bit of ruthlessness. He put all his own money into it, borrowed from rich friends, even mortgaged his wife's property. He was all in betting everything on this crazy plan.
Wow, that's some serious risk-taking.
Oh.
But even with the money sorted, he still needed people. This was a dangerous journey full of unknowns. Who would sign up for that?
Cortés was a master of persuasion. He knew how to appeal to people's desires, the promise of richest adventure, and he framed it all as a religious duty. He painted this picture of unimaginable wealth and glory waiting for them in this new land.
And it worked.
It did.
The power of a good story, especially when it's mixed with greed and ambition. It's amazing the podcast mentions he got hundreds of men to join him, even experienced guys from earlier expeditions. A real mixed bag, but a force to be reckoned with.
And we have to remember, these weren't just nameless soldiers. They were individuals, each with their own reasons for being there, their own stories, their hopes and fears. They were united by this desire for something more, something beyond their everyday lives.
It adds a whole other layer to the story, doesn't it? It reminds us that history is about people driven by a mix of good and bad intentions.
Yeah.
But just as Cortés is getting everything ready, gathering his men, there's a twist. Velázquez, the guy who gave him this chance, starts having second thoughts.
It's like a classic story. The mentor turning against his student, Velázquez, realized Cortés might be a little too ambitious, a bit too independent. The rumors about his aggressive recruiting, the lavish spending, and his growing popularity among the men, it all got back to Velázquez. He started to worry he'd created a monster he couldn't control.
So did he try to stop the whole thing?
He did, but it was too late. Cortés was always one step ahead. He'd already loaded the ships, gathered the men, everything was ready. When Velázquez's orders to stop the expedition arrived, Cortés basically ignored them. He set sail in the middle of the night, a bold move that cut his ties to Cuba and set him on this collision course with destiny.
That's an incredible image. Cortés standing on the deck of his ship, defying the authority that tried to hold him back. But defying orders is one thing, conquering an empire is another. How did he make that leap? What turned him from a rebellious adventurer into this legendary figure?
Well, Cortés was a brilliant strategist. He knew that taking down the Aztec Empire would take more than just brute force. He needed to use their internal divisions to his advantage, create alliances, and most importantly, really understand his enemy. It was a game of intelligence, diplomacy, and cunning political maneuvering.
So it wasn't just about swords and cannons. It was about playing the long game, understanding the complexities of power and influence.
Exactly. And one of Cortés's first moves was genius. Remember the Totonaco people, the ones who welcomed Grijalva with open arms and told him about how the Aztecs were oppressing them? Cortés went straight to them. He knew they resented the Aztecs, who demanded tribute and ruled with an iron fist. He saw a chance to use this resentment to turn them against the Aztecs.
A classic divide and conquer strategy. But how did he gain the Totonaco's trust? I mean, they'd already met the Spanish. They knew what they were capable of. Why would they side with Cortés?
Well, this is where Cortés's understanding of indigenous cultures, or at least his willingness to learn, comes in. He spent weeks living with the Totonaco, learning their language, their customs, their complaints. He presented himself not as a conqueror, but as a liberator, someone who would free them from Aztec rule. And to seal the deal, he made a bold move. He ordered the destruction of the Totonaco idols and replaced them with Christian crosses.
Wow, that's a powerful message. It's like a declaration that the old ways were replaced by the Spanish crown and the Christian faith.
It was a calculated move, a way of showing dominance, while also giving the Totonaco a new belief system, a sense of belonging within the Spanish Empire, a mix of manipulation and genuine belief, a tactic that ultimately won their loyalty.
And it paid off. The podcast says the Totonaco pledged their support to Cortés, offering him warriors and guides for his journey inland. Suddenly, this nobody notary had an indigenous army at his back, a force that would be crucial in his fight against the Aztecs.
Luck definitely played a role in Cortés's rise, but it was also his ability to seize opportunities, adapt to new situations, and forge these unlikely alliances. He was a master at using what he had, and at this point he had a pretty strong hand, but his biggest challenge was still ahead. Montezuma, the ruler of the Aztec Empire, a figure shrouded in mystery and power.
It's like something out of a movie, right? There's the ambitious underdog Cortés versus Montezuma, the ruler of one of the most powerful empires in the Americas, a clash of cultures, totally different worlds.
Oh yeah, the podcast really captures that tension, that feeling of awe and fear, and how both sides made some serious miscalculations. I mean, just imagine hearing about these strange people arriving on your shores with their loud weapons and bizarre customs.
Yeah, it's like something out of a dream or maybe a nightmare.
Yeah.
The episode mentions that Montezuma was both curious and scared.
Yeah.
He sent these messengers with incredible gifts, gold feathers, beautiful artwork, almost like he was trying to appease them and figure out what they wanted.
It's fascinating how the Aztecs tried to understand Cortés and the Spanish through their own beliefs. There
Right.
is this idea that Montezuma might have actually thought Cortés was a returning god Quetzalcoatl, the one associated with feathered serpents and the return of a lost age.
Whoa, they thought he was a god. Seriously? Doesn't that seem a bit too perfect for the Spanish?
Yeah, well, modern historians don't really buy it anymore. While the Aztecs definitely had a complex belief system with ideas about cyclical time and gods coming back, there's not much evidence to say they literally saw Cortés that way.
So it's more about trying to explain the unexplainable, using their own cultural lens to make sense of these strange events.
Exactly. Montezuma was a smart ruler. He wasn't going to jump into anything. He was stalling, gathering intel, weighing his options. Should he fight these newcomers and risk a devastating war? Or should he try to play nice and avoid conflict? It was a tough call, and one that ultimately doomed his empire.
Yeah, the podcast talks about how Cortés saw that Montezuma was hesitant and decided to push his luck. He marched on Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, a city that was apparently just stunning in its size and beauty. Can you picture what that must have been like for Cortés and his men, this ragtag group of Spanish and indigenous allies standing at the gates of this magnificent city?
Oh, it's an amazing image, right? The sheer audacity of Cortés, and then this clash of civilizations happening against a backdrop of massive pyramids, bustling markets, and a civilization unlike anything the Spanish had ever seen.
And for the Aztecs, seeing Cortés and his men, the horses, the armor, those booming weapons, it must have been mind-blowing.
Yeah, a true clash of worlds and one that quickly turned violent. The podcast describes how Cortés, once he got into Tenochtitlan, did something pretty drastic. He took Montezuma hostage, kept him prisoner in his own palace. A bold move. Some might even say reckless, but it shows how far Cortés was willing to get what he wanted.
Talk about a power move with Montezuma under his thumb. Cortés basically controlled everything.
But it was a risky game. The Aztec people were getting restless, and Cortez's men, drunk on their early success, started acting arrogant and greedy, further alienating the population. It was a powder keg waiting to explode.
And explode. The podcast describes this chaotic scene, a Spanish massacre of Aztec nobles during a religious festival. It sparked a full-blown uprising against the Spanish. Cortés and his men had to escape Tenochtitlan in the dead of night, suffering heavy losses. It became known as the Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows.
It was a huge turning point, a reminder that even the best laid plans can fall apart. Cortés, the seemingly invincible conqueror, was defeated, his dreams crushed.
But he wasn't done for. He regrouped, rallied his allies, and laid siege to Tenochtitlan. After months of brutal fighting with disease and starvation ravaging the city, Tenochtitlan finally fell. Moctezuma was dead, the Aztec Empire was shattered, and Cortés stood victorious, the conqueror of Mexico.
It was a victory, but a tragic one. Tenochtitlan, once this incredible city, was left in ruins, its people decimated by war, disease, and slavery. The Spanish conquest was the start of a new era in Mexico, an era of Spanish rule, the forced conversion to Christianity, and the exploitation of indigenous people and their resources.
It's a story that leaves you speechless, full of ambition, betrayal, violence, and ultimately tragedy. The podcast episode did a great job of showing how complex this historical moment was, how individual choices, cultural clashes, and political maneuvering all came together to shape the fate of an empire.
And it's a story that still matters today, a reminder of how the past continues to influence our present. And it leaves us with so many questions to think about. What if Cortés had never set sail? What if Montezuma had made different choices? The possibilities are endless. It really shows the intricate nature of history.
This has been a fascinating journey exploring this pivotal moment in history. Thanks to you for sharing this episode of The Rest is History with us. It's really sparked some interesting thoughts and questions.
It's always great to dive into these historical narratives, untangle the threads of the past, and see how they connect to our lives today.
And for everyone listening, we encourage you to keep exploring this story, learn more about the Aztecs, the reasons behind Cortés's actions, the ripple effects of this clash of civilizations. It's a story that offers valuable insights and makes us reflect on the complexities of human history and the lasting power of the past.